Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Owen Williams. I'm the president of Transylvania University, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second John Marshall Harlan Lecture. I would especially like to welcome the sponsor of this lecture series, the law firm of McBrayer, McGinnis, Leslie, and Kirkland. Some of their partners are here this evening, and we thank you all very much. As you are about to witness, Akhil Amar is both historian and legal scholar, in a manner that I'm sure you will find quite captivating. Please join me in welcoming to the podium an amazingly inspiring professor, an incredibly generous mentor, and my very dear friend, Professor Akhil Amar.
Thank you. Thank you. I especially appreciated those words, dear friend, and right back at you. So here goes. America's Symbolic Constitution. In a polyglot nation of many faiths, ethnicities, and ideologies, the Constitution stands as a uniquely unifying American symbol, a New World Republican version of England's Queen Elizabeth or India's Taj Mahal. But several other iconic texts epitomizing the American way have also helped to bind Americans together, to make us a distinct people with a particular national narrative. These canonical texts have won a special place in American constitutional discourse, even though many modern Americans have actually never read these works, just as many haven't read the Constitution. The most important thing to understand about America's symbolic constitution is simply that it exists. Americans of all stripes can easily name certain texts that stand outside the confines of the written Constitution, yet operate in American constitutional discourse as a privileged source of meaning, inspiration, and guidance. True, once we go beyond this core set of texts, the outer boundaries of the canon are fuzzy, but so are the outer boundaries of the meanings of the words in the written Constitution. Now, we're going to play a little game. I'm going to try to prove this to you over the next few minutes. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the kind of texts I have in mind that I want to say are our common inheritance, our symbolic Constitution. They're not this, the written Constitution, but they're kind of close. And so here's the game we're going to play. I want you, for the next 2 minutes or so, to sort of hear my description generally of the sort of thing I'm talking about, and then I'm going to ask you to make your nominations. And let's see if your nominations correspond with some of the examples that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the evening. Okay, so here goes. America's symbolic constitution revolves tightly around texts. Texts aren't the only things that operate as symbols. England's queen isn't a text, but she symbolizes a nation. George Washington symbolized a nation. But texts have certain special features. They're public, they're democratic, they're uniform. We can all, in effect, read off the same page together. That's not true quite of an individual. Some interpreters of George Washington, for example, might know all about his childhood and marriage, and others wouldn't. We're not quite reading off the same page with a human being. And when you're talking about individuals, there's interesting and complex relationships between private lives and public character that text, to some extent, sidesteps. So my symbolic constitution is going to be about texts rather than, for example, people. True, texts aren't the only things that are public, democratic, and uniform. Think of uniforms themselves, the infantryman's combat outfit, the judge's robes. Think of the American flag, a classic American symbol, rich with constitutional overtones, but not a text in the ordinary sense. Now, compared to the elaborate text of the written Constitution, symbols like flags, uniforms, bald eagles typically lack highly specific propositional content. The beauty often lies in the eye of the beholder. It means different things to different people. By contrast, the texts at the center of America's symbolic Constitution mirror the basic frame of the written Constitution itself. Each is a specific and articulate source of linguistic meaning. Indeed, just as the written text was formally ratified and repeatedly amended by the American people, the written text of the Constitution, each element of America's symbolic Constitution at some point in American history won the hearts and minds of a wide swath of the American people, thereby helping to bind us together as a legal and political entity. Certain kinds of texts are unlikely to perform this function. For example, great American novels are surely articulate texts. Many of them bristle with specific ideas that might conceivably bear on constitutional issues, but novel reading is often intensely private or profoundly universalizing. It's not quite a public and political event tying Americans together as Americans. And besides, which novel should qualify? On race relations, should we pick Huck Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, Beloved, or Gone with the Wind? On privacy, should Lolita be our guide? Should property rights in America borrow a page from Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, those Rand Paul fans among you and Ron Paul fans, or from The Grapes of Wrath and the Jungle for those 99%ers? By contrast, the texts at the heart of America's symbolic Constitution are closer cousins to the written Constitution itself, each having been officially recognized at some point in some way as possessing special American constitutional authority. Thus, the hub of America's symbolic Constitution consists of works that closely relate to the written Constitution. Some of these canonical sources have come from official government sources, others have emerged from the pens or the lips of private persons, but each is widely understood as a precursor to, an implementation of, and or a meditation upon the written Constitution itself. Okay, so we're going to play the game in 1 second here, 15 seconds. The core of America's symbolic Constitution, in sum, consists of articulate texts that bear on constitutional questions, that adjoin, that border on the written Constitution in some sense, and that occupy a special niche in American constitutional discourse. Okay, so if that's the general thing that I want to talk about, my claim is we have an unwritten Constitution, and I'm not making it up. It's not subjective. And there are different aspects of it. Today I'm talking about one, the symbolic Constitution. And in the next minute, I could look very stupid because you'll have disconfirmed my fundamental thesis, or it turns out that we Americans have a lot in common. There really is such a thing. The 6 examples I'm going to talk about today aren't the only ones. So some of you are going to make some nominations. I'm going to say, yeah, that was on my list of 12, but I could only give a few examples. So the floor is open for your nominations. That's one, Declaration of Independence. I came close to that. I picked something slightly, very similar, but that was on my list of 12, but you'll see what I picked instead. I didn't pick that, but I picked something kind of close. The Gettysburg Address. So I could only do so much Lincoln, and I told you already. See, I cheated a little bit. I was tainting the jury pool. But when I told you about Mr. Lincoln, and if you just left it up to me, maybe half of it would have been Lincoln, but I could only pick one, so I picked the Gettysburg Address, which does soar in a way that the Emancipation actually doesn't quite. So the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. I did not pick the Wall of Separation, although I do talk about it elsewhere in the book. I picked that's 3. And that's somewhat like the Articles of Confederation. It's sort of the same era. I picked one judicial opinion. I picked some things from, and I think there are 3 that you could nominate, but if you had to pick a judicial opinion, Brown is what I picked. I could have picked the other 2. What are they? McCulloch and Marbury. So, right, that's Mount Rushmore, okay? We got Lincoln, we got Washington, we got Jefferson, and then, Roosevelt people might debate. Some would want Reagan, some would want Obama. And don't snicker, it's too soon to tell on Obama. So, Brown and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and the Gettysburg Address. I got two more on my list. One is from a private person. The Federalist Papers could be understood as private. And one, and as I'll mention the thing, most people don't pick. But listen, you've made about 8 nominations, and we've come up with like 4 of the 6. That's 5. Okay, so it turns out, this was unrehearsed, I didn't, a hole you guys beforehand, but it turns out the rest of I basically proved half my point right now, so we could all go home if we wanted. And the 6th, as I mentioned, is less commonly nominated. Our friends just to the north of this state would probably, if there were a few more Ohioans here, they might nominate, any guesses? The Northwest Ordinance, for reasons, the groans, okay, but you see, you don't think I've made those up, you see? This is what we have in common as Americans. This is part of our symbolic Constitution. What does that mean? Here's what it means in my view. These works set forth background principles that powerfully inform American constitutional interpretation. Wherever the written Constitution is fairly susceptible to different interpretations, interpreters should hesitate and do in fact hesitate to embrace any reading that would violate the clear letter and spirit of these other canonical texts. In short, these texts are constitutional in the sense that they're constitutive. Adherence to these texts helps constitute Americans as a distinct people among all the peoples of the earth. They're what make us Americans. Adherence to these basic the propositions, these texts. Before examining the 6 texts individually, explaining how each came to form part of the canon and what each has come to mean, we should pause to reflect upon a few general features of America's symbolic Constitution. For starters, these texts form a symbolic network, a system. If I were at some other place, I might use a fancy word like semiotics or something. Don't worry, I won't. These texts connect not merely to the written Constitution, but to each other. Thus, Lincoln's 1863 Gettysburg Address explicitly invoked and interpreted the Declaration of Independence right out of the box 77 years ago. That is 1776. You just do the math. 1863 minus 86, 1776. Okay, that is the year of the Declaration. Okay, what does Lincoln go on to say? 77 years. Our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's a direct quotation from the Declaration. In turn, the 1963 Dream Speech, delivered in front of America's memorial to Lincoln, echoed the Gettysburg Address right out of the box. Here are the first words, quote, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, ... Then, as had the Gettysburg Address itself, the Dream Speech explicitly brought the Declaration into view and quoted some of its grandest language, quote, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, remember, is not from the Constitution but from the Declaration. Moments later, as King warmed to his task and began to describe his celebrated dream, he again conjured up the 1776 Declaration and the 1863 Address. Quote, I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Brown, the case, too found its way into the dream speech, alongside an elegant invocation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship. Dr. King, quote, "The Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs saying, 'For whites only.'" That's Brown. Less obviously, the dream also gestured toward one of the epic themes of the Northwest Ordinance and the Federalist essays, namely that America would stretch westward in an expansion process that would promote freedom. The ordinance itself, by the way, had promised that all western lands covered by its terms would be free soil. So this connection of the land and freedom. Whether or not King had any of these texts consciously in mind, Northwest Ordinance, Federalist Papers, these canonical works inflected his overall vision precisely because they are part of the general American constitutional narrative, the American dream, that King was claiming as his birthright, in precisely the spirit of the Federalist and of the Ordinance. King took his audience on an imagined tour across the land from sea to shining sea. Quote, "So let freedom ring from the prodigious hills of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring." Note that all 6 of our texts directly link to Jefferson and or Lincoln. And I used to have this, a little parenthesis, shades of Kevin Bacon, but my editor made me pull that out. She thought that was too sort of, Generation Y a reference or something. Jefferson served as the lead author of the Declaration and also composed the first draft of what ultimately became the Northwest Ordinance. Jefferson's best friend, political lieutenant, and hand-picked successor, James Madison, authored large chunks of the Federalist. Lincoln grew up in federal territory, first governed by the Northwest Ordinance, wrote and delivered the Gettysburg Address, and inspired King, who chose to speak in Lincoln's, quote, symbolic shadow. In Brown, a Chief Justice, Earl Warren, whose party had been co-founded by Lincoln, delivered a unanimous opinion on behalf of fellow justices whose party had been co-founded by Jefferson. The ubiquity of Jefferson and Lincoln should hardly surprise us, for America's modern Constitution is a two-party Constitution, and Jefferson and Lincoln are the patron saints of America's two parties. The historical processes by which our 6 texts came to enter the symbolic constitutional canon were themselves shaped by partisan politics. Thus, Jefferson's allies in the early republic glorified the text of the Declaration as a way of advancing the popular appeal and political authority of the man from Monticello. The Federalists received applause in the 1790s and thereafter became part of both Hamiltonian Federalists, and never became part of the canon because both Hamiltonian Federalists and Madisonian Republicans could claim credit for the project. When Lincoln sought election in 1860, he and his party had strong incentives to find venerable antecedents for the biggest plank in their platform, a ban on slavery in federal territories. The Republican platform was, read our lips, no new slavery. That's the platform, okay? The North, and we're not going to get rid of it where it exists, but no more. The Northwest Ordinance fit this political need perfectly. It gives him something to claim, he's vindicating the American tradition. In 1863, 1864, as Lincoln sought re-election, Republicans' political prospects depended on persuading voters that for all its death and destruction, the Civil War had been worth fighting, because the very survival of Republican self-government on the world stage was at stake. The Gettysburg Address elegantly made this case. A century after Lincoln, Brown and the Dream speech won praise from persons of goodwill from both political parties in the 1950s and 1960s, at the very moment that leaders of both parties were wooing black voters. Blacks in the 1950s and early 60s are the Hispanics of today. They're the swing constituency. Prominent references to God or religion appear in 5 of our 6 representative texts. Only Brown, which came from a court that would later become famous for its strict anti-establishmentarianism, was scrupulously secular from start to finish. Thus, the Declaration famously opened with references to nature's God and the Creator, and closed with an appeal to the supreme judge of the world and divine providence. So, it's interesting, one of you proposed the letter from the Danbury Baptist. Note who that comes from. That comes from Jefferson, but that's Jefferson, the more anti-religious person, the more anti-clerical person, rather than Jefferson of the Declaration. But see, so even though I didn't pick this one, you see, it's not a surprise that you came up with a Jefferson. Okay, picking up where the Declaration left off, Publius, the author of the Federalist, thrice referred to providence early on, and later echoed the Declaration's reference to nature's God. The Northwest Ordinance declared that, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, unquote. Lincoln's closing sentence referred to, quote, this nation under God, unquote. Words that would find their way with minor tweaking into the 20th century Pledge of Allegiance. That's where the words come from. They come from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And religious reference pervaded the Reverend King's remarks, from his profuse biblical allusions and paraphrases to his thunderous conclusion, quote, when we allow freedom to ring, when we allow it to ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing of the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Even as the First Amendment says that the federal government should stay out of the religious business, and the religion business, and the 14th Amendment incorporates the principles of religious liberty and equality against state governments, the Constitution also explicitly affirms the right of Americans to freely exercise religion. 2 of our 6 works come from non-governmental sources. There's nothing un-American or unconstitutional when John Jay and Martin King, as private persons, professed their faith, even as they entered the public square. Indeed, individuals are entitled to be religious even if they also hold office. Beginning with Washington, many presidents have chosen to introduce religious elements, such as the Bible, at their inaugural ceremonies. In a similar vein, 2 of our 6 classic texts came from public servants speaking in unusually personal contexts. Lincoln was at Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery. A religious reference in this setting was not out of place. The signers of the Declaration penned their names not just as representatives of America, but also as individual human beings dangerously pledging their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor to the patriot cause. Had America lost its bid for independence, these men would have been hanged for treason. Surely they had reason to beseech God's blessing at this terrible hour of moral choice and mortal peril. Proverbially, there are no atheists in foxholes. As for the positive references to religion and to governmental support for religion in the Northwest Ordinance, we must remember this ordinance originated in the Confederation Congress, which is, of course, not bound by the First Amendment. And I have some more stuff on that I'm just going to skip over. Let me now begin to tell you a little bit about each of these 6 canonical texts. Start with the Declaration of Independence. Even before George Washington took his first oath of office, the Declaration of Independence had begun to tightly intertwine with the Constitution in both the popular and the legal mind. The 2 documents both emerged from the same iconic building in Philadelphia, known as Independence Hall today. 6 of the 39 men who'd signed their names on the parchment constitution in September 1787 were especially notable at that precise moment because they had previously signed the parchment declaration. The largest, and that includes Ben Franklin, for example, the largest celebration of the Constitution's ratification, a festive affair involving some 20,000 enthusiasts, fittingly occurred in Philadelphia itself on the Declaration's 12th anniversary, July 4th, 1788. The Constitution's enactment was widely understood as an implementation and extension of the Declaration's ringing language that the American people would enjoy an unalienable right to alter and abolish their government in various situations. And when you actually read the Constitution itself, lots of its rights provisions overlap with rights that the Declaration claimed had been violated by King George. In the 1860s, history repeats itself with a twist. If children of God really do have an unalienable rights given by their Creator, and if these rights logically precede all government, which is legitimate only if it truly protects these rights, and if all men truly are created equal, then surely slavery must end and even states must be made to honor all fundamental rights, many of which were cataloged in the Declaration. Or so thought the party of Lincoln. Whether or not the slaveholder Jefferson would have agreed with each of these points as an accurate interpretation of his own intentions, Lincoln's Republicans re-glossed the Declaration and incorporated their gloss into the very text of the 14th Amendment. Precisely because all men are created equal, all persons born in America would be legally equal, and thus equally citizens at birth, and no government could heap legal disabilities upon a person simply because of his birth status. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment says we're all born equal. What's true in courtrooms is also true in classrooms and family rooms. Every year, millions of students, parents, and teachers visit Philadelphia's Independence Hall and National Constitution Center or the National Archives in Washington, D.C. How many of you have been to one of those three places? Raise your hands. Okay, millions of Americans. Okay. In all of these three grand civic spaces, citizens hear and speak about both the Declaration and the Constitution. When returning home from these venues, ordinary Americans often do so, carrying souvenir copies of pocket constitutions. Many of the current popular editions reprint, let's see if I brought one. Yes, this one does have the Declaration alongside the Constitution, following the general format prominently adopted by the 1987 Commission on the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. So this one is the Constitution of the United States and Declaration of Independence. This is one of like your Bible-led redder version, where Jesus' sentences are all in red. So the Constitution and the Declaration, that's in red. John Marshall is extremely deferential toward the Federalists. Marshall begins his discussion of Publius as follows, quote, "In the course of the argument, the Federalist has been quoted, and the opinions expressed by the authors of that work have been justly supposed to be entitled to great respect in expounding the Constitution. No tribute can be paid to them which exceeds their merit." And then Marshall goes on to lavish attention on the Federalist Papers as if it's an opinion of the court that he has to somehow harmonize with. He doesn't cite a single opinion of the court, in fact, in McCulloch, but he goes at great length to talk about Publius and the Federalist Papers, prove that Publius was on his side. And he does the same thing 2 years later in a case called Cohens versus Virginia. Here's a quote. "The opinion of the Federalist has always been considered as of great authority. It's a complete commentary on our Constitution. It's appealed to by all parties in the question to which the instrument is given birth. Its intrinsic merit entitles it to this high rank, and the part two of its authors played in framing the Constitution put it very much in their power to explain the views with which the Constitution was framed. All told, the Supreme Court has cited Publius in more than 300 cases. The citation rate has skyrocketed in recent decades. Between 1990 and 2010, more than 100 cases explicitly cited to at least one Federalist essay. In one particular interesting 1997 case, the members of the court cited to the Federalist a whopping 61 times. And that case, by the way, only counts as one in my tally, but one of the 300, but 61 times in a single set of opinions. The court's not alone in its respect for Publius. Over the past decade, more than 6,000 law review articles have cited the Federalist, and various Federalist essays nowadays form part of the standard curriculum of many, if not most, high school and college civics courses. So we can test this here. Again, I can be made to look like a fool if the evidence doesn't come through. But you did pick most of the 6, and a lot of you raised your hands when I said, have you been to Philadelphia or the National Archives? Now, how many of you have read a Federalist paper? Okay. This is our symbolic Constitution. It's what we have in common as Americans. I give a few more reasons why Publius is so great, and basically it's because he's really smart and very comprehensive, and he pulls together arguments that are being made up and down the continent. It's kind of the one-stop shopping. It's not just because it's Hamilton who says it or Madison who says it. It's they're pulling together the entire continental conversation. So it's a particularly handy place to begin serious constitutional analysis. Of the 6 canonical works highlighted in this lecture, the Northwest Ordinance is doubtless the one least familiar to the average 21st century American. So that was also confirmed here. That was the one that didn't emerge from the conversation. But this document loomed large in antebellum America and continues to inspire both constitutional scholars and Supreme Court justices. Over the years, the Supreme Court reports have recorded explicit invocations of the ordinance in over 125 cases. Roughly 20 of these have occurred in the past half century in high-profile topics like non-establishment and free exercise, one person, one vote, habeas corpus, educational equality, the right to jury trial. So across a very wide range. Enacted by the Confederation Congress in 1787 and reaffirmed by the new Congress under the Constitution as one of its first items of business in 1789, the ordinance formed a large link in the great chain of American constitutional history. It simultaneously connected the fledgling constitutional system back to the greatest achievement of its predecessor regime, the Articles of Confederation, which is mentioned. See, the Northwest Ordinance and the Articles are from the same era. So it reaches back. It provided a guiding template for the biggest national project of the antebellum era, territorial expansion and the ultimate admission of new states into the Union. And it foreshadows America's next great constitutional achievement, the Reconstruction. So it links back and it imagines the immediate future and it anticipates Reconstruction. In the process, the ordinance helped shape America's deepest ideas about the nature of higher law and the essence of American federalism. Much of the ordinance's substance concerned and confirmed constitutional first principles for America's territories as distinct from states. Territories today occupy a much smaller quadrant of American land and American law than they did in the antebellum period. Back then, a huge chunk of the national landmass had yet to be or had only recently been admitted to statehood, and questions about how that landmass should be governed, most obviously whether, when, and how slavery should be allowed there, ranked among the most important policy and constitutional questions of the era. Nothing, in other words, in the written Constitution would explicitly prevent the United States from acting as a permanent colonizer of people who do not want to be permanent colonists. Nothing would prevent us from treating them the way Britain treated us in the written Constitution. But America's unwritten Constitution would surely frown upon this sort of imperialist policy, and the deep source of this disapproval may be found in the words of the Northwest Ordinance, a charter member of America's Symbolic Constitution. That promises the people from the middle of the country that they're going to be brought in on equal footing and they're going to become states and not be permanent colonists. And that's, the great American promise, and you don't see it in the Constitution, and you do see it in the Northwest Ordinance. The ordinance was initially adopted by Confederation Congress meeting in New York in the summer of 1787, at the very moment that another group of constitutional notables, continental notables, was convening in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to ponder and repair the fundamental defects of the Confederation. As soon as the Constitution commenced operation in 1789, it became necessary for the new government to assure territorial settlers that all the promises that had been made by the old United States were going to be kept by the new management, and that's what the first Congress did. And it promises, for example, that you're going to be secured in fundamental rights, and you're going to be able to claim things like habeas corpus and jury trial, and have just compensation, and have fair apportionment. You're not going to be colonists forever. Eventually, you're going to come in as states on equal terms. Here is the pathway to statehood. That's what the Northwest Ordinance is promising, and it promises that the federal government will never repudiate or breach this fundamental promise. It's forever unalterable. It's in some ways then deeper than the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights could be amended away. In fact, remember, the Northwest Ordinance is promising rights before we even have a federal Bill of Rights. The federal Bill of Rights is proposed later in 1789 and ratified in 1791. But the Northwest Ordinance is promising these rights and saying we can never take them away from you, even by a constitutional amendment. It sort of precedes all legitimate government, this idea of rights. You see that idea in the Declaration, higher law, but the Declaration says this stuff, but it doesn't really put in practice the idea of universal human rights, like a right to be free. The Constitution, its 3/5 clause, was a compromised document on this issue of slavery. But the Northwest Ordinance offered anti-slavery Americans a much purer symbol of what the West could and should be, because it promises no slavery ever in the Northwest Ordinance. It's a symbol of the West, of the future, of hope, of free soil, free men, and freedom. The key clause of the Northwest Ordinance, the golden apple in its silver frame, to borrow a phrase, reads as follows, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted," unquote. If these words look vaguely familiar, they should. When the American people finally put a constitutional end to slavery in 1865, President Williams knows where you see those words. They did so in a 13th Amendment whose words consciously and closely tracked, almost verbatim, and thus paid tribute to the Northwest Ordinance. The ties between the anti-slavery ordinance and the anti-slavery amendment ran even deeper than this textual similarity alone might suggest. Many of the men who pushed the amendment through were men from the Northwest, like Lincoln and Lyman Trumbull, John Bingham and Salmon Chase from Ohio. The old Northwest, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, formed the backbone of the Republican Party. Men from these places filled out the Union Army at every level from Grant and Sherman on down. Without these Northwesterners, there would have been no President Lincoln, no Civil War victory, no abolition amendment. The nationalism visible in the second section of the Abolition Amendment, Congress shall have power to enforce, also has deep roots in the Northwest Territory, in the Northwest Ordinance. You remember the Bill of Rights, how does it begin? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of. And some people just think it says Congress shall make no law. The Tea Party folks, that's their view. Congress shall make no law. Okay. But the 13th Amendment ends saying Congress shall have power, and the 14th Amendment ends Congress shall have power, and the 15th Amendment ends Congress shall have power, and it's carrying on a nationalizing tradition of the Northwest Ordinance. The taming and republicanization of the Northwest was a grand nationalist and nationalizing project. Residents from this region had arrived from many places and inclined distinctly toward a nationalist worldview. Virginians like Robert E. Lee think that Virginia helped create the Union, but people from the Northwest, they see they're Americans first and foremost. America chronologically preceded the states they call home. Indeed, via the ordinance, America founded these states as states. You got a very different image if you're from the Northwest and your territory first, and then in Illinois, Indiana, and then it becomes a state, that's Lincoln, than if you're from Virginia and you think Virginia gave birth to the Union because it preceded the Union. And just as the ordinance presaged the specific language of the 13th Amendment, so the Gettysburg Address foreshadowed the 14th. Whereas Lincoln's first sentence evoked the past, 77, his last sentence envisioned the future, calling for a new birth of freedom. The new birth that Lincoln foretold was nothing less than a national conversion experience in which America, under God, would seek to free itself from the original sin of slavery and inequality. Today, that conversion experience is generally referred to as the Reconstruction. President Williams is an expert, a scholarly expert on just that era. And a new birth of freedom that had as its constitutional centerpiece a trio of amendments that marked the first formal additions to the Constitution since Jefferson's presidency. The opening sentence of the Reconstruction's central amendment prominently featured the word born. All persons born in the United States are citizens thereof. A word that built poetically on Lincoln's imagery of birth and rebirth. Fittingly, this amendment's new birth of American freedom began with Americans' freedom at birth, the freedom of every American to claim citizenship on the day he or she is born. And not just citizenship, but equal citizenship. Because America was, Lincoln had reminded his audience, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created, that is, born, equal. The imagery of birth is visible even early in Lincoln's opening sentence when he talked about how the nation was conceived and brought forth, born, in 1776. The 13th and 14th Amendment are a constitutionalization of Lincoln's vision, which is in turn a reflection on the Northwest Ordinance and the Declaration, sort of a reinterpretation of these documents. American people's profound, albeit informal, ratification of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address didn't end in the 1860s. So I'm saying the 13th and 14th Amendment ratified Lincoln's vision. By re-electing him and then giving him these amendments. But it didn't end then. Lincoln's dream is continuously reenacted in 21st century America as millions of Americans choose every year to make the address their own in some special way. By reading it aloud in a classroom, by committing its ultra-terse text to memory, or simply by pondering its deep meaning and highly resolving that democracy and equality must not perish from the earth, or at least must not do so on our watch. So it's actually, and there's a reason why, and President Williams can tell you why, because he has to write in a very flat way to avoid Roger Taney, who wants to strike the thing down. So he can't make it soar the way he can make the Gettysburg Address soar. S-O-A-R. One of the most important moments of affirmation occurred in 1957 when President Eisenhower, a celebrated war hero in the tradition of U.S. Grant, and the most famous resident of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, responded to the violent efforts to defy Brown's implementation by sending federal troops back into the South to make clear that the Union had won the Civil War and the war had ended with the constitutional promise of a new birth of freedom. Though Eisenhower didn't quite say it this clearly, Ike did not have Abe's way with words. His successor did use his bully pulpit to reaffirm both Lincoln and Brown. Addressing the nation from the Oval Office on June 11th, 1963, just weeks shy of the centennial of the Battle of Gettysburg, President John F. Kennedy told his fellow Americans why he, too, had been obliged to use military troops to enforce the constitutional rights of several citizens who happened to have been born Negro. Not the born language, quote. His remarks are worth quoting at length, for they perfectly illustrate how America's symbolic constitution works in tandem with the written constitution. Let me just read a little bit of Kennedy, and then I'm going to come to my final section. But you'll hear in Kennedy a pulling together of all of these themes, because he's part of the same American narrative. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. When Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color, but this is not the case. Now listen to the born language. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the nation in which he's born, has about 1/2 as much of a chance of completing high school as a white baby born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much of a chance of completing college. 1/3 as much of a chance of becoming a professional man. Twice as much of a chance of becoming unemployed. About 1/7 as much of a chance of earning $10,000 a year. A life expectancy which is 7 years shorter, and the prospect of earning only half as much. Building upon his earlier invocations of a southeastern proto-democrat, Jefferson, and a northwestern Republican, Lincoln, Kennedy declared that this is not a sectional issue, nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It's as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. JFK then reminded America of the special, symbolic significance of the hour at hand. Quote, 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their grandsons are not fully free. Now the time has come for the nation to fulfill its promise. Speaking even more eloquently and urgently later that summer to hundreds of thousands who had thronged the national capital to demand racial progress, Dr. King made many of the same points and called for many of the same legal actions. And then, when Kennedy is felled by an assassin's bullet, as was Lincoln, and is succeeded by a Southern president named Johnson, very different result, because Lyndon is no Andrew, and he gets passed through Congress the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. These laws, which changed the face of America, emphatically affirm the rightness of Brown's vision and King's and Lincoln's. These laws are different from ordinary statutes. They're washed in the blood of American martyrs and heroes. They're more like the Constitution. They conjure up images of Abe Lincoln, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Rosa Parks. Without these things, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, It's impossible to imagine that Barack Obama could ever have been elected president. His election as a tall, slim constitutional lawyer from Illinois, preaching and epitomizing the idea that all men are truly created equal, represents yet another symbolic affirmation of Lincoln, and yet another illustration of the uncanny ways in which the various strands in America's symbolic constitution knit together to form a fascinating network of cross-reference and allusion. Okay, and now my final section. So we've gone through the six and how they fit together and what they mean, and I'm going to tell you about three more things. In particular, three specific Supreme Court opinions occupy the lowest circle of constitutional hell and are today denounced by lawyers and judges across the spectrum. So, Dante will, you know who's in. So, which are the three in the lowest circle? Dred Scott, Plessy. The third one's a little trickier if you're not a lawyer. And some would say Citizens United, no, but too soon to tell. Lochner, the lawyers, and I'll tell you about each, but that's the unholy trinity. Plessy, Dred Scott, a case called Lochner. I'll tell you about it, and I got about 8 minutes more, and then on to questions. Each case presents an example of unwritten constitutionalism run amok, and thus powerfully reminds us of the need to place principled limits on judges who venture beyond the text and original understanding of the written Constitution. So, not all bets are off. You can't just make stuff up, and this shows what happens when you just start making stuff up. Before turning to these three cases, it's worth pondering what general factors seem to be at work in shaping how the judicial actions of one era are evaluated by later generations of judges and citizens. So it turns out that you might say, well, why, do we, oppose Dred Scott? You might think, well, its bottom line was racist and pro-slavery, but there were a lot of other racist and pro-slavery decisions that we don't even remember. You might say, well, it was overruled by a constitutional amendment, but there are other cases that have been overruled by constitutional amendments that we don't hold in a great disrepute. A case called Minor versus Happersett said women can't vote. That gets overruled by the 19th Amendment, but that's not in the lowest circle of hell. A case called Barren versus Baltimore says the Bill of Rights doesn't apply against the states. The 14th Amendment overrules that just as it overrules Dred Scott, but Barren isn't seen as some horrible decision. So morality is part of it. Dred Scott was immoral, and that's part of why it's loathed, but also it's because it made stuff up in a way that Barren didn't and Minor didn't. So it's important that that it basically betrayed the written Constitution. So Dred Scott was a preposterous garbling of the Constitution, as that document was publicly understood when ratified. Remember, it says you can't prohibit slavery in the territories. That's unconstitutional. Remember, that's what the Northwest Ordinance did from day one. It's pretty, and no one thought it was unconstitutional at the time. In a July 1858 speech in Chicago, see, this is not just my after-the-fact criticism of Dred Scott. This is what good lawyers said at the very moment the case came down. You're making it up. Bush versus Gore. In July 1858 in Chicago, there's this lawyer named Lincoln, and he calls the case, quote, an astonisher in legal history. I think that may be OED's first use of the word astonisher. I love that. It's an astonisher in legal history. So right out of the box, he's saying, you're just making this up. And here you see the significance of the written Constitution. Whatever government officials might think they can get away with at the time, in the long run, it does matter whether a case like Dred Scott or a law like the Sedition Act of 1798 or President's actions like Watergate treat the document, this terse text, with respect or with contempt. And the Northwest Ordinance, Dred Scott runs counter to the Northwest Ordinance, whose free soil spirit it negates, counter to Lincoln, who rose to fame as a result of his early criticism of Dred, who becomes president on an anti-Dred platform, who in his opening sentence at Gettysburg is explicitly challenging Dred Scott's dismissive treatment of the equality language of the Declaration. So Dred is arrayed against the Northwest Ordinance. It's opposite Lincoln. Plessy runs counter to Brown and the Dream. Precisely because the Northwest Ordinance, the Gettysburg Address, Brown, the Dream are iconic elements of America's symbolic constitution, their opposites naturally enough provoke special revulsion. So there's a system here. There's a pattern. This isn't just totally random. Chief Justice Taney's 1857 opinion for the court in Dred Scott in effect claimed that citizens had to be white, a word that nowhere appeared in the founders' text and the founders had pointedly omitted, in part because free blacks were in fact citizens and voters in several states at the founding. Even more preposterous was Taney's claim that no federal territory could prohibit slavery, a rule that nowhere appeared in the founders' document that plainly contradicted the original understanding. Dred Scott also treated landmark congressional legislation, most obviously the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, with contempt. The court also claimed that moral considerations, the wrongness of slavery, were wholly irrelevant to constitutional issues under consideration. But there is room for persons of conscience to properly consult those consciences if the Constitution's written provisions are in fact fairly open to different interpretations, and if one of these interpretations would lead to a grossly immoral result. If the law is ambiguous and one thing is clearly immoral, that's a tiebreaker. The spread of slavery to virgin soil was precisely such an immoral result, because slavery was surely an immoral institution, regardless of slavery status as legally protected system where it already existed. Plessy. In 1896, the court disregarded the rather plain facts that the written Constitution promised that blacks would be treated as equal citizens, and the whole point of Jim Crow was to deny black equality, to treat blacks as inferior. This judicial disregard cannot be justified by appealing just to some vague notion of an unwritten Constitution, because the unwritten Constitution should never undo the rights you have. Adding new rights is one thing, but undoing the rights that are actually there, it says equal, that's very different. Now, remember I said Lincoln is saying Plessy's made up from day one. How about Plessy? It's Lincoln. It says stretched on. Yeah. How about Plessy? It's 8-1. But it's not anachronistic. So, Amar, where do you come off saying, that this is all made up? It says equal, and the justices are just not following the Constitution. Here's where I come off. The terms of my criticism are the very terms used by the first Justice, John Marshall Harlan, in his famous dissent, issued the same day as the infamous majority opinion. Remember, Lincoln says it's an astonisher? Harlan writes that, quote, the judgment this, I want you to listen very carefully to this, because this is a lecture in honor of this man from Transylvania. He says, quote, the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, unquote. A remarkably prescient prediction, and an uncanny one, once again illustrating linkages between the different elements of the canon of America's symbolic constitution. He's alone in dissent. And he's not just saying you guys are wrong. You guys are as wrong as it's possible to be. You are wrong in the way that Dred Scott was wrong. And if he said that in every case, you could say, well, he was a crank, but he didn't. He saved it for this case, and that's what he said. This is like, and history has come to embrace his position and to understand the connection that this is just like Dred Scott. This is like Babe Ruth's called shot. It's stunning. In the same way that Lincoln, from the very first moment, understands what Dred Scott is and gives it a name. Lochner versus New York is less well known outside legal circles, but for lawyers, the very word Lochner is synonymous with judicial overreach. Lochner isn't just a case, but an era and an attitude. In legal discourse, it's even become a verb. To Lochner, or to Lochnerize, is to commit the same kind of judicial sin that characterized many of the court's rulings in what's now known as the Lochner era, roughly between the mid-1880s and the mid-1930s, when the court, without clear textual justification, struck down a multitude of reasonable reform statutes regulating free market excesses. So that case invalidated the maximum hour law. Other cases invalidated minimum wage laws, and the Constitution doesn't, render these things unconstitutional. It's basically the Constitution being read to just side with the fat cats, with the 1% at the expense of the 99%. The symbolic Constitution exists as a system of meaning and guidance, both positive and negative. Here, as elsewhere, we must not only probe individual parts of the system, but must see the constitutional project as a whole and ponder larger patterns of meaning. Here is one way to connect the dots. In sharp contrast to America's most disgraced cases, which protected haves at the expense of have-nots, sweatshop owners, slavocrats, and insiders at the expense of outsiders, most of our icons of positive national identity have championed equality and reflected abiding concern for those at the bottom of the status hierarchy, tyrannized colonists, politically vulnerable territorial settlers, ordinary unnamed soldiers who died on a bloody battlefield, black children relegated to second-class status, the Negro who is still not free. In this pattern resides a powerful lesson for how America's unwritten Constitution is best interpreted and enforced, namely, to reinforce rather than to undercut the great themes of equality and inclusion in America's written Constitution. That's what he was trying to tell us. Thank you very much.